Thank you, Dr. Chi. I mean, the last point you just made is absolutely valid. We talk about an informal sector, but and recognize that there's such a huge, that is such a huge sector, yet we haven't been dimensioned, they haven't been dimensioned in a manner that helps us to support them properly. We're going to come round to you again, so I just need to have the other panelists give their views on a few things. Professor Fong.
Sorry, Madam Moderator, the audio is not, audio quality is really a bit concerning. I can barely hear. I don't know if it's from my end. Okay. I don't know if the other virtual participants have that problem.
Well, I'll hear
from... Yes, it is.
Could you hear me well?
We can hear you very clearly, but I also think that the team at the back is also looking at their system to see if there's any challenge with them. Thank you. Professor Fong, when I introduced you, I started by saying that you have managed in such a difficult environment to deliver housing for majority of Hong Kong through a government vehicle. Okay, so what levers did Hong Kong or did you apply to manage land access, which is a real challenge for you, and to finance the program as well? And just with the little that you know about West Africa, or about Nigeria particularly, what is the one thing that you would say we should look at doing to help us to move the needle a little bit?
Thanks, Shimoka, for the question. I think Hong Kong is quite unique in our sense, and government has been doing a lot to help the lower income families gain access to affordable quality housing. First is the public rental housing. So the Hong Kong Housing Authority was established in the year 1973, and government gave us a little bit of seed capital to build public rental housing. And the rent is governed by ordinance, housing ordinance. The rent we charge is around 10% of the median household income. And we provide public rental housing to around 30% of the population in Hong Kong. Now the land was given to Housing Authority free of charge, but you need to pay rent for that. And this is public rental housing. And with the people, they have some money in the pocket, so they can use it to spend on the commodities, consumption, retail, etc. And this will mean economic activity. So we make the money move around, and when they gather some capital in their pocket, we build subsidized sale flats. We call the home ownership scheme for those income who has just exceeded the public rental housing. And so we provide subsidized sale flats to around 16% of the population in Hong Kong. So how do we make that work? Now for this type of housing, government will need us to pay something. So we pay 35% of the construction cost for these subsidized sale flats as the land formation cost for government. Government have to provide services, roads, drainage, water supply, etc. And then these flats were sold to these eligible owners at around 70% of the market rent, market prices. Sometimes 65, sometimes 60%, depending on the house prices at that time. And when they have to sell these later on, maybe they move out and they move to private properties, they can sell and resell these flats. And that is, if they can sell to the same income brackets, they just sell it. But if they want to sell it at market price, then they can still do so. And they will pay the premium difference and sell it to private market. So when these flats are being sold to private sector, they become private flats as well. So it's a kind of housing ladder that we built, from the basic public rental housing to subsidized sale flats to private properties. And this government and housing authority work together to make it work, and of course the people also make it work. And for interest sake, in the 1980s, when we first have these subsidized home ownership schemes, some banks offer 105% mortgage. Reason, not only the house price, because we give them the mortgage guarantee, and we have the buyback guarantee. And what are the extra 5% is for their home furnishing, home decoration. So you can see everybody chips in to make things work together. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm assuming that we all heard that. And I mean, this is a situation where the end game is clear. And so all the parties kind of work together to make sure that we get there. Who's going to want to leave, you know, a cycle like that? Not going anywhere. Thank you very much. Quick now to Fatou. Fatou, I'm going to quote something that you said. You said, buildings aren't just structures. They are the sum total of policies, supply chains, and economic logic. So you need speak to us about how and what models have emerged for co-creating housing with women so that they're not just beneficiaries, but as decision makers in the planning and the operations of this home. And what will it mean if we were to adopt something in Nigeria?
So, good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everybody. Thank you for the opportunity to participate. I think there's a slight lag, but I'm hoping you can still hear me. So there are many examples all over the global south. So in Africa, I can think of examples that are in Namibia, small examples here, big examples in Senegal, in India, about cooperative housing structures that bring women together to be able to, in an organized fashion, intervene into housing delivery. But rather than describe the projects, I think what becomes really interesting is looking at why those models actually work. And in my opinion and experience, I think it's because they are closely aligned to the housing delivery chain. So every city has a housing market, and a housing market has multiple different housing value chains. And so by organizing women to intervene formally in areas of the housing value chain where, frankly, they're already present, but they're largely being ignored, is really why the success of the collaborative, collective, or cooperative model can actually start to work for women to be able to intervene successfully in housing intervention, specifically on the delivery side. Now, you ask how we can possibly adapt this to Nigeria. I think the first step is recognizing that when we're talking about Nigeria, we're potentially talking about a whole nother scale. By the end of the century, there will be some of the biggest cities in the world, or the biggest cities in the world will be in Nigeria. And so really, if we still use the thinking of the housing value chain, which is typically 7 steps, right? You know, you go from your land to your infrastructure to regulations that govern then your design, construction, maintenance, and offtake. So those seven links in the value chain. If we can start to formalize women's participation in unlocking the different elements of value chain at the planning stage, at the finance stage, also in the land acquisition stage, and really start to integrate that into formal frameworks and systems, not only does it increase women's lobbying power to allow them to then have conversations with local authorities, with national authorities, with other groups in the private sector, but it really gives them a kind of institutional support to be able to make housing possible for women while acknowledging that the construction sector is conservative and slow to evolve. So instead of waiting for the construction sector to evolve and recognize women, we continue to organize and formalize the way that women already intervene in the housing value chain, get that recognized, and I think that would be a successful way for us to start to intervene in Nigerian housing markets. Thank you.
Thank you, Fatou. What you just said now sounds like such a simple thing to do. Intervene in the 7 processes or the cycle of delivery and make sure that you formalize the role that women already play but are largely unrecognized in those 7 steps. I think it's some work for us to do here. Thank you. I'm coming back to you, Yemi. When I asked Yemi to join the panel, I said to myself, this is the one outsider. So we're going to start with Yemi, the investor. I don't have any data to support this, but actually very little funding, I am sure, goes to women startups in our sector. So what would you say to an early stage women-led startup that's operating in an area that impacts housing, whether it's access to housing, land rights, infrastructure? What must she do to get the attention of early stage funders? I might have to pass this to you.
Thank you, Jumoke, and good afternoon, everyone. Yes, I'm outside of my ecosystem. Yeah, thanks for inviting me. So if I put on an investor lens, right, one of the unfortunate things is that the patterns of investing follows familiarity. So I will invest in something that I am familiar with or whom I am familiar with, right? And this enables me to sort of de-risk in terms of my investment. So if you look at that alone and you say that a woman in construction, right, or a woman in housing, she is already in a male-dominated environment where investment is fully dominated by men, right? So whether it's 2%, only 2% of funding on according to McKinsey statistics, only 2% of the global funding comes to women. So first of all, comes to women, and then therefore in different sectors that are understood. Now, if you come to housing or if you come to construction, you're already moving against the tide as a woman in housing and looking for funds, because those that are going to make the decisions are looking for something that is familiar to investing. So that already puts you at a somehow disadvantaged position. Therefore, as a woman in housing or construction or this industry, you have to work twice as hard, right, as a founder, to be able to attract investments for early stage. Twice as hard means that you must understand your value proposition. You always should come from a standpoint of whether pitching in a way that talks to regulatory shifts or that you anchor it on cost inefficiencies. Investors like those kind of, market things that they're going to de-risk. And also, you must also know that you are solving a problem, a major problem. And that is the lens in which you would come in, and you would attract, right? The second thing I would say is that for you to be able to attract, it is not only about your pitch deck. It must also show some level of traction or value other than your pitch deck or what you're showing. And one of the things I say is that leverage your network. So strategic alliances, strategic partnerships, you need to project that. So I know the local government and I know the authorities in the land ministry or some sort of cooperative. It shows added value as a founder. So it's not only about what you want to do or the problem you want to solve, but that you have all of these networks. The third thing I would say is, when you came up here, you said, help me get the women. It is almost always the same story. We have to look for the women to come out. We have to always try and grab them and say, speak, right? For a woman who is a founder in this industry, she must be able to command the trust of an investor by whether she's speaking at events, whether she's going to the urban development summits, whether she's advocating for financial instruments that for housing, you must continue to speak so that you're seen, so that they know that it is not only that you're trying to solve a problem, but that you have the connect, you have traction, and that you have a voice. So those are the three things I would say would attract an investor to a woman in the industry.
I think that was exceptional, and so to the women in the room. So I know a lot of us, we know our craft, but that's really where we put it to. And one day, we put that craft into a pretty looking document. Then we keep it there for a long time and wonder why not. So participation in the sector, becoming known as a problem solver, making the connections. And she's talking and I'm looking at myself. Many of us are guilty of not making, and even when we make, we don't keep the connections. So that's an important ingredient for facing investors who largely do not even understand our sector. We have to know that. Thank you, Yemi. So I'm coming back to you, Dr. Chi. Following what Yemi just said, I want to draw on your Pan-African view on women's participation in the supply side. So tell me, what investment frameworks have worked to ensure that women-led enterprises across the value chain, e.g. whether it's manufacturing, tech, or services, have similar access as to those run or managed by men?
Okay, thank you once again, Architect Jumoke. And yeah, in terms of investment frameworks, there are quite a number of them available out there, investment frameworks really supporting women's interventions in construction, leading to manufacturing and the supply side dynamics of the housing value chain. I think the issue is that, there's no mechanism for really analyzing and gathering the data, of women within these frameworks and what they've done, what they're doing, and be able to assess impact of the contribution of the intervention within the construction sector. One of these frameworks, I'm sure you're aware of, Architect Jumoke, is AFAWA. That is the it's by the African Development Bank. Let me get the full acronym right. AFAWA is Affirmative Finance Action for Women in Africa. AFAWA Finance leverages the African Development Bank's financial instruments and has two innovative solutions to support women. One is a $300 million risk-sharing instrument to unlock $3 billion in credit for women. And the second one is a TA component, which provides advisory services to financial institutions. AFAWA also engages African governments, as part of the enabling environment, creating the enabling environment for such, and other key stakeholders to support legal, policy, and regulatory reforms, and strike down the structural barriers impeding women in the construction, in the business, and specifically in the construction sector. I believe in 2018, AFAWA in Nigeria made an anchor investment of $12.5 million in IDF managers, the first of its kind private equity fund managed by experienced female fund managers. That's why I say you're probably aware of this. Last year in Togo, for example, AFAWA partnered with AFDB, the African Guarantee Fund, to finance a program availing $3 billion to women-led small and medium-scale enterprises through financial institutions. And Shelter Afrique obviously also has its own investment framework. Gender is obviously one of 4 thematic strategic pillars for Shelter Afrique. And the bank has really undertaken a lot of interventions supporting women within the construction sector across Africa. There are several examples, probably too numerous for me to mention here. There's also collaborated with EDGE, IFC, and other multilateral development banks, African Development Bank in question, to really undertake training programs like the one held in conjunction in Ghana, in conjunction with the Ghana Green Building Council, to equip women in the construction industry with the knowledge of green efficiency measures and choices that will ensure optimum operational cost savings. There are country-specific frameworks available. Back to Ghana again, there's the Ghana Women's Fund, which is a microfinance institution established as a soft lending window for women. I would also like to mention a report by the IFC and CAHF, that's the Center for African Housing Finance, called Her Home Too. I'm sure many of you have heard of that report, focusing on Ghana and Senegal, the sequel to the well-acclaimed report that was done about 3 years ago, I believe, called Her Home. This lists a number of such frameworks as savings-linked products, which can overcome women's thin credit lines, housing microfinance coupled with construction technical assistance, and access bond facility that allows women to pay ahead of schedule and then draw down what they need to shift the mortgage loan facility from a liability to a savings vehicle. There's a SAWIC. SAWIC is South African Women in Construction, focusing on empowering women in the construction sector in Gauteng, South Africa, and provides resources for women for career development. Again, there are several of these frameworks. The issue for me, and that is one of the to-do that we need to look at, is how do we begin to gather the data around these interventions, because they are there, and analyze them and really assess and evaluate the impact, which is quite significant and substantial, of women's intervention in the construction sector in Nigeria and across the continent. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. So what I hear you say is there are a number of interventions. I'm surprised that I think you might have mentioned Ghana at least 5 times. I didn't hear enough of Nigeria, but still, the outcomes would be exceptional. And I've taken what you just said on board, and I'm going to speak to you again as to how we can raise, whatever fund it is that we need to do that exercise of assessing impact. I can connect what you just said also with Fatu's comment about formalizing women through the value chain and seeing that, because access to all these types of opportunities, financing opportunities, would happen more efficiently when women are in formalized groups. Fatu, both Yemi and Dr. Chi touched on supporting women to ensure a more inclusive participation. Let's talk a little bit about today's urban landscape. So in the consulting work that you do across the globe, how have you ensured that urban design actually reflects the lived realities of women, particularly in cities? And is there a different way to think for, less urban areas and informal settlements across Africa?
So thank you for the question. I think when we talk about urban design and consulting, we have to start with the tools that are currently available. And I work on planning codes, which guide what should happen in cities, zoning regulations that are more for neighborhood level interventions, and design guidelines for residential buildings or commercial buildings and what have you. But at each scale, what we're seeing as the baseline is that the realities of African women's lived experience does not appear in any of those codes at any one of the scales. And I think using data, even though data is missing, one of the benefits I have to admit in Rwanda is that I've been able to access data on women, and specifically to see that 90% of working age women, they're engaged in own use production work. So they're doing work in the household to support their own household. At the same time, 92% of women are actually active, very active in the informal sector. And so what happens at this dual burden, this dual kind of labor that women do, is not recognized in any of the codes that I mentioned before. And so that really means that we have to go beyond just formal data and find other ways to do data collection and to be able to capture these stories and lived experiences of the African household, and then the African woman at the center of that household. Now, in informal settlements, this becomes even more acute of a need, because the programs that we need to support those women is actually even more complex. So we're talking about multifunctional spaces. We need spaces for security, spaces that allow proximity so women can do whatever they need to do without having to rely on a transportation system that might not service their neighborhood properly. So we really have to start with a series of participatory diagnostics, really centering women's voices, mapping how they navigate the space, their access to water, their access to markets, their access to childcare, transport, all those things that I know people are very familiar with. But we have to start to figure out, and the work that I do, to integrate those specificities for women into those codes so that we can only not resolve or address the issue in one place, but that we can have a larger, more systemic approach to this inequality that we're seeing. And I think there's really a great opportunity where it comes, when we start to talk about climate change, and especially in informal settlements. Because women are, let's be clear, especially in households, obviously, they're the ones who are responsible for driving mindset change. At the same time, they're also the ones currently innovating to be able to respond creatively to the climate challenges that they're facing. So, you know, I've seen in some of the work that we do also storage systems, fuel alternatives, cooperative savings, all those things are done through women in these informal settlements. And they're the ones who propagate the solutions. So really we need to, and what we've done is to stop saying that we will be designing with women as one of the vulnerable groups. So it's usually women, children, persons with disabilities, are special groups, but rather say women are actually our co-creators in designing these spaces. They're no longer a vulnerable group. They're very active participants. And I think the climate, the climate change discourse is an incredible opportunity, especially because as we start to come in with new materials and alternative building technologies, all different kinds of ways to adapt nature-based solutions to the neighborhood level, women have the opportunity to really own those discourses. And so I hope we really persevere and capture those voices to be able to amplify them and make their role even more concrete and visible, particularly in these unplanned settlements. Thank you.
Thank you, Fatu. The key point I take away from what you just said is, it's funny, I've always wondered why, when the category of the vulnerable group always includes women, and I've often wondered why. But the point you're making is that women should be, center stage in the making of decisions. So it's co-creation rather than creating for the so-called vulnerable group. Thank you for that. I want to let the technical team know that the screen here has gone off, so you might want to come back and put it on. While we're waiting for that to happen, Ada, what did data do for you? I mean, that's a really straightforward question. So can you speak to how your agency integrated all of that data, particularly gender data, in planning and delivering and even post-completion evaluation of the public housing portfolio?
Thanks, Jiboke, for the question. Data is very important. What gets measured gets done. So after occupation, 1 year post-completion, we do a survey of our tenants for the public housing estates or the owners and find out whether the design and the provisions meet their needs. Starting from the year 2004, that's the year where we started. And we target the satisfaction rate to be around 70%. But then, as we improve the systems, the scores get higher. And by the time I retire in 2017, the score is around 95% satisfaction. And we not only gauge the current provisions, we also ask some insightful questions to the details. For instance, when people change from the gas cooking to cooking by electricity, the cooking bench we provide will have to be adjusted. So for the subsequent or the future planning and design of our estates or the provisions, we allow the cooking bench height to be adjusted. So this is how we allow this public opinion, particularly from the women who do the cooking, will let us know what is their real need from the home economics point of view. And by the way, we always practice safe, secure, healthy, and well-being living in our estates. So women's views are very important. Just like Fatou mentioned about security for women going home, we provided security gates at the main entrance. And for the lifts, for vertical transportation, we have the CCTVs. So people, including women, can travel safely back home without any fear of harassment. So first point. And next, you may ask, how about those women in genuine need? For example, those affected by violence or domestic violence, what do we do? So we have compassionate housing or rehousing. But first of all, they need social workers to help them. And there are NGOs who can help them to give them the first level of support. So this is how we also help women in need. So altogether, we have built up a kind of safety net, and not only for women, but for those in need. So all the housing estates are designed and planned for inclusive living, for those who are for people of different ages and different abilities to move around freely, safely, and securely. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Dao, I seem to have missed you out. So I'm going to ask you a question on finance first. And this has been a major topic since this conference started yesterday. Nigeria has a very large informal sector. We've talked a lot about that as well. And you're working in economies where there is a sizable informal sector as well. So what models have proven effective in de-risking women who work in the so-called informal jobs, enabling those women to perhaps improve their eligibility and definitely access to housing finance? Oh, Dow isn't there. Oh, I see. Okay. Thank you. All right. So I'm going to come back to you. I think it will be Yemi, because you haven't said a thing since the first time. Now I'm going to talk to Yemi, the tech guru. So proptech and contech, where are women? There are many women in the housing space. They remain users rather than creators or co-creators. How can we drive more female-led tech innovation in the housing and construction value chain? So earlier on, we talked about how can we finance? Never mind finance. Where are they? And do they ever show up?
Where are the women? I think that, you know, women, when we're looking at technology and this industry, we are seeing that a lot of the women are playing in the space of maybe legal advocacy. They're playing in the space of looking at the coming in from the finance space in the construction. And so they are building applications that are, you know, sort of fintech-led, you know, rent-to-own, digitizing documentations and ministries and things like that. I think we need to change the entry point for women into this sector, and for them to be able to leverage on technology, for us to be able to see them more. I will use the healthcare sector as an example. We used to sort of look for where are the women in healthcare technology. And for the life of us, we were seeing women doing things about logistics, right? Logistics, taking the medications from here, home, and everything. Until the pharmacists, the doctors started to look critically at how to solve problems for maybe for the elderly, right? And therefore came up with solutions that dealt with the core of the medicals, right? At the same time, technology was evolving, and as such, many women were able to use technology and create. In the construction housing industry, the technology is evolving. But it has to be, if you say, where are the women? It has to be those women that are already in the construction and housing space, looking for those solutions to solve and leveraging on technology. And that is how the innovations will come out. And that is when you will begin to see many more women in technology solving problems. That said, if we look at the intersection of how to innovate, intersection of housing on climate resilience, intersection on housing on, somebody talked about urbanization, intersection of housing on urban safety or migration, you will begin to see that you are looking at solving a problem with an innovative lens. And when you start to do that, you start to leverage on technology. You know, so it has to be a combination of that. And then more importantly, we have to be intentional. Intentional in funding. Dr. Chi mentioned a lot about funding. Technology in itself is expensive, if I must say so myself, to create, right? And so the question would then be, how do we as a housing industry start to look for those pool of funds? Because Dr. Chi was talking about AFAWA. AFAWA is agric. She was talking about things from Ghana and therefore other industries, right? And so for this industry in particular, how do you then create that fund that will enable you support the women that want to innovate in proptech or you know, construction technology? And it has to be really intentional. And that pool of funds, she talked about how there was a collective effort in making sure that the solutions were solved, right? And so even within the industry, I heard a lot about government here today. The government will not solve a lot of our problems. They might, and the policies are all there. The policies are, somebody said about 28 years ago, he had written something, and it's still relevant today. So the policies are there for us in Nigeria. But then how do we as the industry start to look for those pockets of money that will help the female gender, you know? And it has to be particular. So I'll give you an example. Rising Tide, we have a gender lens. Rising Tide is an angel network that I run, and we have a gender lens. We support women, early stage founders that are women that have a gender lens, whether you're owning or you're leading or your product has a gender lens, right? It is deliberate. ABAN right now is looking at climate change, right? And so they have